I'm going to open up this scene called Birch Leaf Model. And this is just a very simple model of a leaf, and it's going to form the basis for our Photoshop texturing. So I want you to note here that I've UV mapped this. If I open up the UV texture editor and turn off the image here, you can see that quite simply I've UV mapped the top and the bottom. I've used a planar projection, and the edges form just a small part of around the edge, and then the stem again is just two halves, and then the butt of the stem. So the top here, let's make sure that we get this right, because this is going to be important. So if I just choose a face on the top side of the leaf here, okay, so that's the top one, the top shell, and if I turn it around and I get the bottom, then you can see that that face is selected on the bottom shell. So I know for sure that this refers to the top and this refers to the bottom. It's important that you know before texturing which UV shells correspond to which parts of your model for obvious reasons. And so one of the first things we'll do is we'll definitively mark those. What we want to do is we want to export these UV coordinates as an image for Photoshop. And the way we can do that is under polygons, we can choose UV Snapshot. So I'm going to choose UV Snapshot. Basically, this is just going to take a screenshot, a little bit more than a screenshot of the UV coordinates. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to want to browse to our textures folder, and I'm going to call this leaf UVs. And we want to set a size. So the size here, it's good to sort of think about how big you want your texture to be. And maybe I want my texture to be 2K. So what that means is 2048 by 2048. And if we have this keep aspect ratio checked, then it'll automatically adjust the Y if we change the X. We can leave the rest as is, except for the image format, I want to choose PNG. And PNG is going to include some transparency, which isn't that relevant, but in this case we'll just choose that, and we're going to hit OK. If we go over to our Finder where we have our project, we've got this new image here called Leaf UVs, and if I open that up, you can see that we've got the UVs as an image. Great. So I'm going to drag this onto the Photoshop icon so that we can open it up in Photoshop, or I could just do File, Open, and navigate to the same image and open it up. Before I get started painting here in Photoshop, I tend to prefer to set up the Wacom a little bit. I don't know if it's non-standard or standard, but I'm going to come over to the Wacom Drivers. And last week we talked about having the pen button be the middle mouse button and the right click button. So I'm going to leave the top one as right click, but the bottom one I'm actually going to choose Control Option. And the reason why I like doing that is that will allow me to change the brush size and the brush hardness from my stylus itself. And if I jump back into Photoshop, what that means is if I click the bottom button, and I can just tap and drag and change the brush size and also the softness or the hardness there. So that's how I prefer to do it. You can set it up however you like, but that's what I'm going to do. Okay, so I'm going to save this as actually a Photoshop file, and I'm going to call this leaf texturing, maybe class 1. In the same folder. And I want to set up my layers a little bit at the beginning. So the first thing I want to do is create a new layer, and I'm going to call the bottom one, I'm just going to call it background, and we're not going to do anything really on that layer, so it's just going to form sort of the base for our texture. So I'm going to hit Command Delete to fill with the background color, which is currently white. I just want to fill this with white. And I'm going to take my pen tool, get a bit of a smaller size, and write top and bottom. And if you had a more complex UV layout, this might be a way that you could sort of keep track of exactly what all of your shells corresponded to if there was any ambiguity. Okay? So now I'm going to hit the lock icon for the background layer, and now I'm not going to be able to do anything there. I'm also going to call this top layer, I'm just going to call it UVs. And I'm going to set this to multiply. And actually, if you I'm trying to remember, in Maya we set this to have white lines, so I'm thinking that the reason that we can see them is maybe just because of the anti-aliasing. So maybe what I want to do is invert the image, adjustments, invert. And that's just going to make it a little bit stronger and clearer. And then use the multiply layer. So anything that we paint in the intermediate layers, the UVs are always going to sit on top and they're always just going to form that. And so I'll lock this layer as well so I don't inadvertently paint on it. And at any time I could hide those if I want to see my textures on their own. So in this one Photoshop file, I'm going to be painting 3 different channels or 3 different textures. The main one is going to be the color. Then I also am going to be painting a bump map, and I'm also going to be painting a specular map. So what I want to do is I want to create some folders so I can group those together. So I'm going to create one group here, and I'm going to call this color, and I'm going to put it in between the background and the UVs. I'm going to create another one. I'm going to call this one bump. And I'm going to create another one and call this specular. And that way we can keep track of what we're actually painting and how to organize it. And it means we don't really need to create 3 different Photoshop files to create different maps. So it's all sort of self-contained. So I'm going to create a layer within the color, and I'm going to call this leaf base color. And this is going to form the base color for the leaf. Now I could get a green color and start painting away. But what I want to do instead is I want to get some actual leaf color involved here, because variation is really going to sell realism. And so if I just create this all with one color, it's not going to necessarily look realistic. Although we could layer it up, and if we wanted to paint it by hand, that would definitely be okay. But instead I'm going to go File, Open, and I'm going to navigate to my References folder. And I've got a number of references here, and what I was aiming for, maybe talk about the references a little bit. What I was aiming for was a birch leaf, and I looked up the Latin name, the Betula papyrifera, and got some references for those. I can pull them up here in Finder, maybe just cycle through those. So that's kind of the leaf that I was looking for. So we've got the front of the leaf, this nice green color, and then the back of the leaf here with some really nice veiny texture. And another front of the leaf here. And what I wanted to do is, because I wanted to create some really high resolution texture, I was looking for some high resolution images, and I couldn't find anything that would be suitable, and that also I would run into copyright issues if I was directly painting copyright images on my leaf. So what I ended up doing was I just went into my front yard here, pulled a few random leaves off of a tree or a bush, put them on my flatbed scanner, and scanned them at a very, very high resolution. And this isn't anywhere close to the full resolution that I could theoretically do. The scanner, depending on the flatbed scanner, you can get ones that do like 6,400 pixels per inch or something like that, and create single images that are gigs in size. So this is quite sizable. This is 8,000 pixels by 8,000 pixels, something like that. And so this is going to give us some nice texture to work with. The other, not to get on too much of a tangent on flatbed scanners, but flatbed scanners are fantastic for actually getting some texture data. But the other thing is that in contrast to a photograph, a flatbed scanner has a very, very shallow depth of field. So anywhere where this leaf bumped out at all, then we lose a lot of detail. You can see that there are some areas here where the leaf has wrinkled, and so we lose, it's really kind of fuzzy in that area. Anyway, so that's something to think about. But I do recommend using flatbed scanners to kind of create some really high resolution textures. So in Photoshop, we are going to open up both of those, the leaves front and leaves back reference. And because I captured the images myself, I am perfectly happy to have them be used in my work, and you guys can use them as well. So in order to sort of see them side by side, I'm going to go to Window, Arrange, Tile All Vertically. And I really wish that I had, you guys have a really nice wide monitor. Unfortunately, because I'm constrained to the projector, I don't have the full width of the monitor to take advantage of. So I'm just going to arrange these. Okay. So what I'm going to do here is get the clone tool. And with the clone tool, I can hold down Option in this window and Option click or tap on the tablet, and you're going to sample an area. And then I can click over in this window in my working and then change my brush size to be a bit bigger and maybe a little bit harder, although some softness on the brush is actually going to be, is going to be benefit. And making sure that we're on the leaf-based color layer, I'm just going to sort of start painting here. And if I get to the edge here, I'm just going to undo that. I can resample in here and sort of paint over that area. And you might notice that we're painting these, we're including some veins in our painting, but we'll take care of that later. Now there is a setting, and I think it's this aligned setting. And the aligned setting, if I uncheck that, what is going to happen is every time I release the stroke, it's going to reset that sample to be the original sample. And I do kind of want that to keep the aligned off, so that I don't end up running into the edge of the leaf here. So I'm just going to keep painting around. Okay, so now that I've kind of got that base area with some little bit of variation in the color and stuff like that, I'm going to use the spot healing brush with a little bit larger, and I'm just going to paint over some of these veins. And Photoshop, with all of its magical wonder, is going to just sort of get rid of those details that are not appropriate for this layer. And we want to make sure that we've got this content-aware function set for the spot healing brush. So maybe some of the larger blemishes I might not want to be working with. So now I've got sort of a base color that has a little bit of variation, but it's still fairly plain, right? I haven't got any of the veins in it yet. So now I'm going to do the same thing with the bottom one. So I'm going to get my clone brush, find a nice area here. Maybe move this over. Maybe sample that area, something like that. And then in the bottom layer, I'm just going to paint. You can see that the color is quite different. And again, technically I'm not painting a birch leaf. I'm painting whatever the species was that I grabbed, but obviously if you're painting a specific species, you want to make sure that the coloring and the texture match what you're actually intending to reproduce. Now, this has some nice veiny detail, but I actually don't want that on this layer yet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get the Lasso Tool, or the Lasso Tool, depending on how you pronounce it, and go over this region here on the bottom leaf, just so I've got that one selected. You could work with this on a different layer too if you wanted to. And I'm just going to go Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and I'm going to get a radius of something like 5 or 6 pixels, and sort of blur out that detail. And so we've got that color and we've got the variation, but we don't actually have those veins painted in yet. We've got this leaf-based color. Now I want to make a new layer, and I'm going to call this one Top Veins. And I'm going to check back with my reference. And maybe this one I do want to just sort of... we've got quite a light color for the veins. And they are fairly spaced apart. It's when I'm not a botanist by any means, but you want to think about the morphological features. So these veins don't always originate from the same point, although sometimes they do. And they don't always, well, they line up with, I guess, the major serrations. So you can kind of think about that. And they're fairly light in color. So I'm going to try to sort of replicate that. So I'm going to kind of get this sort of a yellowy, light yellowy green color. Make sure I've got my brush tool. And maybe now I can sort of close out the reference for the time being. I can always bring that back. And because variation is key, I'm going to go into the brush window, so under Window, Brush, or F5. I want to turn on some color dynamics, and just very, very subtle. A little can go a long way. So with the hue jitter, maybe 2%, maybe 4% for the saturation jitter, 4% for the brightness jitter, something like that. And then if I'm stroking, there's just a little bit of variation there, and maybe even that's a little subtle. So I'm going to turn up the saturation jitter a little bit. Okay, so the first thing, well, that looks kind of, doesn't look as good when I'm actually painting on the surface, so I'm just going to choose a slightly different color. I'm also going to paint the stem. Actually, not on the bottom, just on the top for now. Reduce the brush size a little bit. And I really wish there was a steady stroke like there is in Mudbox. But basically, maybe I'll redo that. You could hold the Shift key if you want it perfectly straight, although that might not be what you're after. So just, I don't have a very steady hand. That's why I work in Maya instead of painting. I just realized I think that we want apply per tip on here. Let's see if that, yeah, that's what we want. Okay, so I'm going to undo that, and I'm actually going to make the brush just a little bit softer. Okay, something like that. And then I'm also going to paint out these main veins. And again, I really wish there was steady stroke because my hand is not steady. The aim here is not to create a wonderful photorealistic leaf texture as much as I would like that to be the aim, but just to kind of get a sense of how we can use some of these tools together to our advantage. Okay, so if we look at the, again, going back to the reference, if we look at the back side, we can see that obviously these main veins are going to perfectly line up with the main veins on the other side. They're the same structure. So we want to make sure that those line up. So what I'm actually going to do with this top vein is I'm going to duplicate the layer. I'm going to right click, duplicate layer, or Command J, thanks. And I'm going to call this bottom veins. And Command T is going to select that everything in the bottom veins and transform it. And in the height, what we want to do is, because remember this is a mirror reflection top to bottom, we want to choose -100 in the height. So that's setting the vertical scale, right? So now you can see we've got one layer for the top, and then the bottom layer is going to be mirrored. And we can move this guy down and line it up. Something like so. And hit return to commit that. And now we should have a mirror image that's going to correspond the bottom and the top together. So those are the main veins. So a very important thing to remember when you're painting diffuse or texture maps, you might, the goal here is not to replicate your reference exactly, because what you'll notice on the reference is there's shadow and light information in here. And we don't want to include any shadows or any real sort of lighting effects in our texture, because that's going to be happening in the 3D software, right? You don't want to shadow, you don't want to sort of create little highlights and shadows and create form on this color part, because that's going to, it's either going to become redundant or it's going to be conflict with the lighting information that you have in your 3D scene. So these diffuse maps are just about the color information.